Well, hello and welcome to Whistleblower Heroes, Everyday Heroes, and educators sharing the information that you need to know here on Revolution Radio. And I'm your host, Ella. And you can join us live every Tuesday starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and every Friday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time by visiting freedomslips.com and clicking on Studio A. So with me today, I have Mr. Gary Noesner, and he is an FBI negotiator, speaker, and author of Stalling for Time, My Life is an FBI Negotiator. So Gary, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Al. It's a pleasure to be here. In retire.
Well, again, I just really appreciate that you're here. You know, so these shows I do are like tributes, and your work is very important to us as Americans and even to the world. So you save lives. I don't think people realize the importance of your work. So I'm very happy to have you aboard. So I guess, you know, I'm going to start talking about how did you end up as an FBI negotiator? What in your life, and also what was your life prior to this job in particular?
Yeah, I mean, being an FBI agent was sort of a childhood dream and goal. And once I became an agent, in the early 70s, there was a brand new emerging discipline in law enforcement called hostage negotiations. And it was really something the FBI borrowed that the New York City Police Department had started, and the FBI sort of grabbed hold of it and began to teach it around the United States and around the world. And as part of my new agent's training, it was discussed as a new and emerging discipline, and there's something about it that had instant great appeal to me, and I made a mental note that I wanted to try to get into that once I had the eligibility and the time in as an agent, and that's what happened. And I did it part-time for quite a few years early in my career, and then eventually moved up to be one of the full-time FBI negotiators and eventually the chief negotiator for the FBI for the last 10 years of my 30-year career.
Okay, and then maybe, I know you've been involved with some very well-known cases. Will you share with our listeners some of the cases you've been involved with? Because I know everyone's heard about, the Waco incident, and I know just from researching you that you've been involved with some very interesting cases.
Yeah, I mean, just off the top of my head, in addition to Waco, probably the best known, as you mentioned, I was at the Republic of Texas siege in Texas, which was a right-wing militia standoff. The Freeman siege in Montana, which was, again, anti-government separatists. I flew to Peru when terrorists took over the Japanese ambassador's residence and held Americans hostage. I've flown up to LaGuardia for skyjacking, been to Africa for kidnapping cases, traveled throughout the Middle East, done a number of interesting things in my career, and negotiations hasn't been the total focus, but it's been a big part of that. Number of prison riots, Talladega Prison, St. Martinsville, Lucasville Prison. So typically when there would be a major incident and the FBI was involved, I would be deployed.
Okay, I understand. So how long, I'd like to talk about the FBI a little bit, just for my listeners who aren't very familiar. What is the job of the FBI? Everyone's heard of it. People have seen it on television. But in your opinion, what would you say the FBI's main purpose is? And then also your job, what exactly that entails, and what your objective is as an FBI negotiator?
Yeah, the FBI's function is pretty broad. There's a number of federal law enforcement agencies, but the FBI is charged with investigating most of the crimes that would be considered a violation of federal law. To investigate those crimes, identify perpetrators, charge them, apprehend them, bring them to justice, try them, and through the whole process. And the FBI is pretty diverse, works organized crime, it works political corruption. Obviously, terrorism is a major part of the FBI's activities these days, white-collar crime. So it's got a pretty broad portfolio of challenges, and that's worked out of 56 field offices spread throughout the United States. Each office has a SWAT team in addition, and a negotiator should there be an incident involving federal jurisdiction that they respond to. Those are typically part-time personnel. Then back at FBI headquarters in the Washington, D.C. area. We have both the FBI's hostage rescue team, which is sort of a high-end counterterrorism tactical team, and the crisis negotiation unit, the unit that I headed, that provides the negotiation resources for the FBI and overseas for the FBI in incidents where an American citizen's been kidnapped or if there would be a terrorist situation overseas. So day in, day out as a negotiator, and I and the supervisors who worked for me would provide instruction to police. We would respond operationally to assist in situations, whether telephonically or in person. We would do research. For example, how do you best deal with someone threatening to commit suicide on a bridge? What are some of the best approaches? What are the risks inherent in interacting with someone? Just as an example of the kinds of things we research and look into. So it was a pretty diverse job, and one that I enjoyed a great deal. It required a lot of time away from my home and a lot of challenging incidents, but it was certainly a memorable career and well worth it.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the examples? You were just talking about working as a negotiator and what the overall objective was. What are some examples? I'm trying to figure out how to word the question there. Specifically, I mean, I understand what you said in the beginning of our interview, but I'm just curious. I guess, what was the day like? Say when you were at the Waco, during the Waco incident, what was that day like? And from what I understand, also, just to kind of go back to something else I was thinking about, from what I understand, that even within the FBI that was part of this case, there was conflict, which was really interesting to me. I never thought about that until I heard that in your interview.
Well, it's not unique to the FBI, but there has historically been a sort of clash of wills between those who you would say were tactically oriented and want to use force to resolve problems, and those in my discipline, negotiations, that realized intense, dangerous situations where life is on the line, that we're often wise to use our verbal skills to avoid further violence and to de-escalate and to bring about a successful resolution. Now, that could take place at a bank robbery where the police have responded and the bank robber's holding the employees and customers hostage because they want to get out. It could be in a jewelry store. It could be a hijacking. It could be someone holding a hostage in a prison. Any number of settings that you can imagine. And obviously, there has to be specialized personnel there to contain the situation and potentially conduct a rescue if required. But philosophically, in law enforcement, we want to use the least amount of force necessary. And the behavior of the perpetrator will basically determine what we do. So as negotiators, we're trying to appeal to someone who may feel very desperate, may be emotionally high. We're trying to bring them to a point where we can gain their cooperation and move them away from violence. And obviously, it takes some training and experience to be effective. We typically function in a team context to maximize our combined knowledge, skills, and experience.
Great. And if it's okay with you, maybe we can go into some of your specific cases, like when. Okay, I guess, let me see. There's so many questions I have. So I understand, that you guys had a television series, or that recently came out, a television show about Waco in particular, which most people know about, as we were just talking about. How close was Hollywood's rendition to what actually happened? And also, are the emotions the same as you see? Because I know Hollywood is known for kind of amplifying all the emotions. So I'm just curious how close it is to what you actually experienced and what really went down.
Well, speaking specifically of the 6-part Paramount Network Waco miniseries, I think overall they did a pretty good job of displaying the complexity of the situation, and their objective was to show the perspective of the Davidians and David Koresh from the inside looking out, as well as those of us from the FBI and the outside looking in. So they purchased my book rights for that latter part, and they purchased the book rights of David Thibodeau, who was the survivor of the day of the fire, to talk about what the Davidians were thinking and what their assessment was. So it's a unique program in that it showed both sides of an actual incident. It's kind of rare to get that glimpse. I didn't 100% agree with the director's portrayal of Koresh, which I think it was a little too sympathetic. Koresh was a pretty bad guy, a pretty manipulative guy. He also had a charming side. And they certainly wanted to show that, and I think they did a good job, but I'm not so sure that they adequately painted his sinister, self-serving, manipulative side. But it's hard, since Taylor Kitsch, the actor who played Koresh, was so brilliant. He's a very likable person in both real life and on screen, so it's hard to, I think, to have him be as sinister as perhaps I would have liked to see. In terms of the part, they showed a lot of conflict, and in fact, there was a lot of conflict. There was two competing schools of thought. Initially, the negotiation approach was given great leeway, and my team and I were able to work towards getting 35 people out during the first half of the ordeal. But the time span, the pressure, the expense, the criticism of the FBI began to drive some of the decision-making, causing some to want to take a more aggressive, more confrontational approach in dealing with the Davidians. And so that's not uncommon. There is a historical yin and yang between tactics and negotiations, but in this particular incident, it became a problem. And while I totally blame David Koresh for the behavior that led to the final unhappy ending, I think the FBI also can be rightfully criticized for sort of a departure from our normal way of doing things. That yin and yang I mentioned is, is not supposed to still be a factor, yet it was at Waco.
Yeah, and also one thing I just wanted to let the audience know, because I also heard this on your interviews. In that particular case, they were not actually hostages.
No, I mean, and that's an important thing to point out, Ella, because, when someone's holding a hostage, it's a very specific crime. So, someone is a hostage who is being held for the fulfillment of the substantive demand made upon a third party. In other words, I'm trying to get money and I can't get it on my own, so I'm going to threaten my hostage that if I don't get this thing that I want, I'm going to harm the hostage. It's the only card I, the bad guy, can play to try to get what I want. It's also used as a shield to keep the police, say, from coming into the bank to arresting the bank robber because he's holding and threatening the lives of hostages. So that's hostage taking. But probably 90% of what negotiators, both in the police and the FBI, really do are more emotionally involved incidents where the person being held, the life on the line, is not necessarily a hostage. They could be a family member, a loved one, an employee. There's no real demand being issued in order to secure the release. Rather, it's the perpetrator's demonstration of anger, frustration, whatever. So if a guy goes into his apartment and he holds his ex-wife hostage because he's still mad at her for leaving him, and the police show up and say, hey, we're here to negotiate, he might say, I don't have anything to negotiate. I don't want anything from you. Go away, leave me alone. I have her, and I'm thinking of killing her. So those are the most challenging incidents because they don't really need anything from you. So we have to use a slightly different set of skills there to create a relationship of trust, and we can't bargain per se. Again, if the guy's in the bank and he wants a getaway car, we're going to make him trade hostages in order to get that car, or he may never get it in most instances. But there's a quid pro quo bargaining interaction. So at Waco, if you look at that, going back to Waco, the people who were inside, some might classify them as hostages to the situation, but in reality, none of them were hostages. They were his family, his loyal followers. They were where they wanted to be. So he didn't want anything for him. He didn't need anything for him. The only thing he wanted from the government, ATF and the FBI, was to go away, leave us alone. And that was really couldn't do. So our ability to exert leverage on him to do what we wanted was severely limited.
Yeah, I see that. I imagine that maybe not as much as I think, but I would imagine that it must be scary dealing with these type of characters and people with this psychological makeup to you as agents.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge. I mean, because you're aware of the fact that he's not, in that instance, speaking of David Koresh again, he wasn't threatening to kill any of his people, but there were many children in there, many clearly innocent. And we're trying very hard, very desperately to try to come to a peaceful accommodation, dealing with a person who was very narcissistic and very manipulative and would make representations and then would not follow through. And it could be very frustrating. So, we always say as a negotiator, you have to first and foremost control your own emotions, because if you can't control your own emotions, how can you be expected to influence someone else's? So but we have to keep our, Rudyard Kipling used to say, if you can keep your head about you when all else are losing theirs. I mean, these are some of the ways that I would describe a good negotiation effort. We have to be calm, focused, and really pay attention to what this person's saying and how they're saying it, and try to find some common ground and build relationships so we can influence their behavior.
What kind of training goes into the type of work that you do, or the type of work that you did? Is that something that takes a couple years? I know a lot of people, FBI agents that I've interviewed in the past, they have law degrees, which was interesting to me. I didn't know that so many people do.
Historically, I mean, under the Hoover years, the FBI used to say that all the agents had a law degree and an accounting degree. I don't think that was ever remotely true, but
okay.
The FBI certainly hires many of those in both categories, but there's far more agents that have neither one of those degrees. But in terms of negotiation, when we find an agent who is a particularly good interviewer, someone who gets confessions, someone who is good at developing informants, in other words, good interpersonal skills, and that person shows an interest in becoming a negotiator, then they attend an 80-hour, very intense national crisis negotiation course where they get their formal training. And then, of course, they get on a team back in Omaha or Dallas or Minneapolis, wherever they're at. And then they, as situations arise, begin to practice those skills and get better and better at it. But it's sort of a self-selection process that people that want to do this, they get the training and they become lifelong students. But the attributes that you would look for, that I would look for in training someone is someone has a good bit of self-control, that has those comfortable communication skills. And it's a hard thing to define, but they're just kind of likable people. How do you define likability? But those are the attributes that make successful. I used to get in the habit of when a situation was resolved, we would ask the perpetrator, what was it that the negotiator said that made you come out? And the answer was always pretty much the same. It was, well, I don't remember what you said, but I like the way you said it.
Fascinating.
Yeah, if you think about that, that's really, really powerful because, we're talking here on the phone, do you like my voice, the pace of, speaking? Do I sound friendly or interesting or, not confrontational? All those and many other, things lead someone to draw a picture of someone. And if we convince this person that we're talking with who may be having the worst day of their life, if they're dealing with an FBI negotiator, how do we convince them that we're not here to make your day worse, that we want to see you come out of this alive? And when we say you're not going to be shot when you come out, you can trust us, and we mean it. So those are the kinds of, I'm trying to give you in very words a very, very complex topic, but I think you get it. I mean, you'll know it when you see it. That person, someone you meet at a social function, and you say, wow, that was a really interesting person to talk to, a really nice person. And in fact, they seem more interested in me than, and asked me a lot of questions about me and wanted to know about me. And, I like that person. I'd like to see him again.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking about that just the other day about likability. And I think it has to do with relatability. You can relate to them on some level. And the people that seem to be relatable have kind of a world, they have, it seems like they've experienced a lot and they understand people and they have an empathy for people. They're not as judgmental. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the business guru, Stephen Covey, says, first seek to understand and then to be understood.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of the way a negotiator is. I mean, if I get on the phone as a negotiator and I start telling this person my life story, and I'm not learning anything about him, he's learning a good bit about me, but that's not why we're here. I have to certainly be responsive to questions that person raises, but I want to learn about them. I want to genuinely, sincerely learn about what brought us to this point, what the person's thinking, what he's angry at, what frustrations, confusion, bewilderment, whatever it might be. And if I'm able to demonstrate that I understand their point of view and what they're going through, it's a tremendous tool to use to build a relationship. And I don't suggest for a moment that it be done in a false or phony way. I think good negotiators are sincere and genuine.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. But you can still say objectively that a person is flawed deeply and a danger. I think that's part of the difference too. You guys, when someone is just a dangerous personality. And even, I have some experience with people like that. And criminal psychology is fascinating. And it's the world we live in. And it seems to be, I don't know if it's just there's more information out there. It seems like there's just more dangerous personalities out there than ever. And I don't know if that's true. It's just something I think about sometimes. The world, and maybe it's my line of work because I hear about these types of individuals in the world.
That's my impression as well. And I think it goes to the complexity of society now. I mean, in human history, not that many years ago, people really didn't have a lot of choices. I mean, you did what your father did for a living. If you're a woman, you had a defined role, and there weren't a lot of choices to worry over or stew over. And society is terribly complex, and people have to make decisions. And inevitably, there's winners and losers in that process. And people feel left out. They feel discriminated against. They feel victimized, even when it's their behavior is the reason for that. So it's not surprising that people act out in very dangerous ways, self-destructive ways, and I don't think that's going to decrease. I mean, why do these young men come into these schools and decide to engage in violence? Certainly, never heard of anything like that when I was growing up, but it's there now. It's probably not going to go away. It's going to be a continuing problem, and there's just a myriad of issues like that. And look at our political discourse today. We can barely have a conversation on different sides of the aisle without getting into a huge argument. And it's unfortunate. I don't have a ready answer for that.
Yeah, it's very polarized. Just to touch, briefly upon politics, it is very polarized in this day.
Yeah, I mean, you either agree with me or you're my enemy. It's a zero sum. I think that's unfortunate. I think as a negotiator, I have a natural proclivity to want to accommodate and find middle ground and put aside the challenging issues that you realize you will never probably satisfactorily agree to, but find those areas where you can find an agreement and use that as a stepping stone to further the relationship. We all want to work with people that we like and respect. And, so that's really the first goal. We talk in negotiations. Your goal should not be to start off trying to find some grand solution to this person's problems or issues. Your goal really is to create a relationship first. You have to earn the right to be of influence. It doesn't accrue just because you're a special agent of the FBI or you're some sort of official. You haven't yet earned the right and demonstrated that you're worthy of their respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. And one thing I'm kind of going back just a little bit, kind of all over the place here. Stockholm Syndrome. Is that something you ever witnessed?
Well, it's
you should tell people what it is first. It's when the hostages start to sympathize and have, and I don't know I think it's vice versa too, with the hostage, or the hostage starts sympathizing with the person holding them.
Yeah, it goes back to a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden in the 70s, where this pretty bad set of characters were holding hostages in a bank, and they held a couple young female tellers, and eventually a romantic relationship ended up developing out of it. And so for the first time, psychologists looked at this phenomena, and it's called survival identification. And there's really, three components to it. And one is that if you're a hostage in a dangerous situation, you might fear the police more than you do the perpetrator. The guy's telling you inside, I'm not going to hurt you. It's just those bad cops out there that want to come in here and kill everybody. So that's one part of it. The other part is when the hostage might begin to have positive feelings about the perpetrator. And that is, if I like him and am nice to him and help him by looking out the back window, maybe he won't hurt me. And the third, when the hostage taker returns some positive feelings, which then makes it less likely they'll harm the hostage. That's the one we really like to see. In reality, the Stockholm Syndrome is pretty rare, and you rarely see it where there's been a strong demonstration of violence, because that tends to break someone's false belief that this person is not capable of violence. In other words, if you're in a bank and the guy comes in, the first thing he does is kill the bank guard, you're not likely to later on say, well, he's really a nice guy, because you've seen him do something pretty terrible. Right. But it can be exaggerated, but it's part of the reason that if a negotiator is talking to a hostage during an incident, we don't give them a secret such as, hey, duck below the desk in 5 minutes because we're coming in the back door to get him. You would never do that, because for fear that maybe that hostage will say to the perpetrator, they're coming in. So that's an example of where it might come into play. But again, it's extremely rare and highly too many people attribute it to too many situations where it really does not exist. The FBI statistics show it's hardly ever seen.
Yeah, I think there's just so much fear. I mean, I think in that fear, a person, and just to see that type of behavior, I imagine that it is rare. But it's a topic that sometimes comes up within conversations with people like yourself.
I worked a situation once, or helped out on a hostage situation in school, and a young man had not killed anybody, but he certainly had discharged his weapon and was holding some hostages in the school office. This is quite some years ago, and there was a middle-aged woman who worked in the office who really befriended this young man and treated him very nice during the ordeal. And when the negotiators were talking with him, he began to say things like, and I forget her name, so I'll make one up, but he said something like, well, poor Mary's had a really hard time today. I know this has been difficult for her. So when we hear the gunman say things like that, it really makes us feel more and more confident that whatever bad this person has done so far, he's probably not going to harm the hostages, because there's a positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an indicator. Mm-hmm. I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Your readers might, or your listeners rather, might be interested in another famous story from one of the Dutch train incidents from many years ago, where Moluccan terrorists took over a train, and in one of those, they decided to kill a hostage, and they had identified a man to kill, and they told him, you're the one we're going to kill. And the man says, okay, but before you kill me, can I pass this message to my wife? And he turns to a complete stranger who was also a hostage sitting next to him, and begins to say all these really amazing things about how much he loved his wife and his family, and how much they meant to him, and that he had a good life, and he wanted them to go on and have a good life, and really the sort of tender and endearing things that we all wish we would be smart enough to say, thoughtful enough, I should say, to say if we knew we were about to die. And after listening to this, the terrorists said, "No, not you," and they went and killed somebody else. And what we learned from that was that this randomly selected hostage with no name, no face, no connection, all of a sudden became a human being in the eyes of the terrorist. And that changed his behavior and said, "No, I now heard that you love your family and you have this, you have that, and I'm going to go do it to somebody else." Sadly, did kill somebody else. But it makes the point, I think, about, and in fact, we tell people in hostage survival, if you're taking a hostage, this old thing about name, rank, and serial number, you have to avoid the extremes of being overly compliant or overly defiant. But if you have an opportunity to personalize yourself and converse with your hostage taker, it's probably going to enhance your survivability.
Mm-hmm. Are you able to hear me clearly? Because of something, I had a little glitch, it seems like, on my Skype.
I can hear you. Can you hear me still?
I can hear you. Yeah, it's just a strange noise. Okay, well, that is a really interesting story. Very interesting. And what do you think the most successful, or what were the circumstances around one of the more successful negotiations you ever had that you guys are really afraid that a lot of people were going to, or did you just assume many people have the possibility of being killed?
Well, there's quite a few of those, but I mean, one comes to mind, and I think it has a unique place because Waco was in 1993, and obviously very controversial. A lot of accusations and investigations and examinations of what went wrong, what was done right, what was done wrong. And even though the FBI defended itself publicly, there was a clear recognition within the organization that some leadership decision-making had been faulty, that the strategy that the negotiation team had recommended should have been followed. So 3 years later, in 1996, we had a 85-day siege, much longer, in Montana against the Freemen. And this time, the now director of the FBI, Louis Freeh, who was not the director during Waco, basically had great confidence in the negotiation process. And he says, "I'm in no rush for this to end. We're going to do it the right way." And negotiators do it. And it took a long time, but we approached it in a very methodical, organized way. And everybody surrendered. Not a shot was fired. Now, it took 85 days and a lot of money. And it also fell immediately off the news media radar screen because nobody got killed. There was no fire. There was no dramatic footage or, acrimonious resolution. So it just goes to show you it's a massive success that gets no coverage. It's the failures that we tend to really focus on.
Mm-hmm. I imagine so. So then I'd like to go back to your book. How did this come about? Why did you feel compelled to write this book?
Well, it's a very good question, Ella. I mean, I had retired from the FBI in 2003, and I became a full-time kidnap consultant for a company that assists corporations and individuals resolving kidnap situations around the world. But after my retirement, and even when I was still in the FBI, I realized I had been a unique participant in a lot of historical events. And so many people said, "You've got to write a book with all the things that you've done." And enough people told me again to believe that maybe I should. And so I thought about it. And finally, after I'd been out for about 5 years, I was ready to give it a go. And fortunately, I was contracted by Random House, now Penguin Random House, to write the book. And I went part-time, so I had the time to write the book. And the rest is history. The book did quite well, and I'm very proud of it. And, it doesn't just chronicle my life, although it does that. It sort of chronicles the evolution of the negotiation process. And, I'm an advocate for it, obviously, because I believe in saving lives. And you may find this hard to believe, but the lives that are most important to me as a law enforcement negotiator are police lives. So every time a negotiation team can resolve an incident, where the police do not have to go in and confront someone in a potential shootout, that's good for us. Certainly we want to save innocent life and hostages and even perpetrators. But the real bottom line is that police officers go home safe every night. And this is proven time and time and time again to be the most effective way in these highly dangerous and very tense situations for that to happen. Mm-hmm. So those were the motivations to write the book, to kind of lay out the principles. And no one had really written a book that explained it that way. And, it's worked out good. I think it's the highest selling book on the hostage negotiation process that's ever been out. So I'm proud of it.
Great. For people who haven't kind of looked at the book yet, did you have help with the book? Did you talk to other agents to bring it in?
Yeah, I wrote the book myself, and I delivered a lot more than made it in the book, but I had some really top quality editing assistance that was invaluable. And but the actual writing was mine, and there were a lot of incidents that didn't make it in the book. I remember the publisher saying, "How many prison riots do we want to hear about?"
Right.
So they certainly know the audience for these things, and the typical length of book that audience wants to read, and it had to be fast-paced and, told interesting stories. So, I certainly deferred to them. But, no, I had, good literary agents and a lot of good support, and friends helped me with some information. And I'm just glad I wrote my book in the age of the Internet. Boy, it made the research a heck of a lot easier than it would have been 30 years ago.
Yeah, I imagine so. I even remember, I'm kind of just pointing or touching upon something. I remember being young and wanting to research, and you had to go to the library, and sometimes you had to wait for books. For the internet to make that easy.
Yeah. And there'd be things like, even though I kept a lot of notes, there'd be things like when I went to Peru for the Japanese ambassador's residence siege, I couldn't remember the exact number of hostages held, but 2 seconds later on the internet, you got it. It's quite amazing. It's a great tool for authors.
It really is. Absolutely. So what other plans? We still have like 20 minutes. What plans do you have for the future?
Well, I've kind of divided my time now. I'm the old Douglas MacArthur speech before Congress about, you don't drop out, you just sort of fade away. And, I'm trying to stop and smell the roses a bit more. I live on a great, beautiful place in Virginia. And, you say and I've got 6 grandkids now, and that really bring a lot of joy to my life. And so I still travel some and do some corporate speaking, mostly, occasionally a law enforcement conference, but I'm not living in airports like I did some years ago. That tends to get a little bit old. When
you say corporate speaking, what does that entail?
Well, typically, a corporation will have you name it, the full gamut of industry, and sometimes they'll have a corporate retreat for their executives. Sometimes they'll have it for their HR leadership, their sales force, very often. And how do they, what can they glean from the negotiation skills used in life-saving situations to enhance relationship with a client, a vendor? How does an employee engage better with their subordinates or their superiors? Yeah. So, life is in negotiations. Let's face it, Elle, right? And whether you're dealing with people you have to deal with on making this radio show. It's all a negotiation. It's gaining cooperation. It's avoiding problems, or if problems arise, it's helping alleviate them in an equitable way that doesn't leave a bad taste in anyone's mouth. And and then our families. My goodness gracious! Literally everybody can benefit from that. And how do we talk to our children? How do we talk to our spouse, our neighbors? And most of it really boils down to being a good listener. And I'm probably a better teacher at it than I am practitioner at home. Sometimes is my there's the old saying about familiarity breeds contempt, and there's a history there, and you know each other so well. You sometimes, I think it's inevitable in human interaction to take one for granted, but you really try to say, hey, listen, I really want to sit back thoughtfully and listen to this important story that my spouse is telling me about this experience they had, and acknowledge it and ask questions about it and encourage them to tell me more about not just what happened, but how they feel about it. It's a powerful tool. Instead of just saying, yeah, I'm listening or I hear you, you're demonstrating it because you're paraphrasing back. So you started this show and this is why you wanted to start it. And this is why you enjoy doing it. And this is the pleasure it gives you. And these are the challenges you face in putting on this program. So, these are the kinds of questions that we should all kind of discipline ourselves to address. It's amazing. You go to a cocktail party and for your listeners, they can try this at home. Next time they go to a social event, find someone that may be at that party that you don't know, or someone that you don't know very well, and make it your goal to spend a little time talking to that person about what they're doing, why they're doing it, what's important to them. It's interesting here in this lake where I live. There's a lot of retirees, and you meet people and you say, hey, what brought you here? Well, what did you do back in Philadelphia? And wow, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. And it's amazing how often you say, I really enjoyed talking to that person. We should go out to dinner with them, or we should see them again. And it's just amazing if you put the effort in what you can learn about people and what kind of friendships you can develop.
Mm-hmm. And people are just really interesting, to me at least, and probably to a person like you. People are fascinating. They really are.
Everyone has a story, literally everyone. And, some are shy about it, but, you can find ways to get them to bring it on. I always tell a funny story that I was in Memphis a few years ago and giving a speech, and I was at a hotel by myself, and I went to the hotel bar I don't like room service, and I don't like sitting in a restaurant by myself, so I go to the hotel bar and I get a steak and a glass of wine, and I talk to the bartender, and watch the basketball game on the TV. And this guy all of a sudden rushes up to the bar, and he's got surgical scrubs on, and I decide he's going to be my target for the night. And so I said, excuse me, sir, I couldn't help but notice you've got surgical scrubs on. Are you a doctor? Did you just come from an operating room? And he goes on to tell me how he's a medical device salesman. And I said, well, can I ask why you have the scrubs on? He said, well, I go into surgery and I show the doctors how to use this stuff. Now, we hold doctors in very high esteem in our society. So I really inflated this guy by saying, so you teach doctors what to do. And you could almost see his posture straighten out a bit,
Imagine. Yeah.
After half an hour, I knew where he went to school, where he lived. I knew his wife's name, his kid's name. I knew so much about this guy, and he still doesn't even have my name yet. He doesn't even know who I am. And to me, it's just kind of fun. I wasn't trying to be mean to him or manipulate him for a purpose. I was just trying to see how much could I find out before, because people like to talk about themselves. They like to stay in their own frame of reference, and we're all guilty of it. So after close to an hour, I finally say, hey, I've got to give a presentation tomorrow. I've got to go to bed. It's very nice talking to you, Bob. You're just a great guy. I really learned a lot. And you could see him sort of be perplexed, and all of a sudden it dawned on him. He said, well, what did you say your name was? I said, well, I'm Gary Noesner. And where do you work? I said, well, I'm retired. I used to be the chief hostage negotiator for the FBI. I said, have a good night. And I walk away from him. And I look back at his face, and he was just, you could see he was saying like, gee, I might have learned a thing or two as well. And and it was just kind of fun. But and again, it's not a sinister thing or a negative thing, but
you're just curious. You're a curious person.
Just kind of fun. And I can't tell you how many interesting people I've met either on an airplane. I mean, sometimes I just want to get my book and read and not be bothered, but sometimes you end up with a very interesting conversation. And whether you're the airport waiting room or a hotel, restaurant, or bar, or whatever it might be, on some sort of public transportation. And that's fun. And people should sort of, I think, take this out and test it, I used to tell guys, you're traveling on the road for business. I said, call home tonight and ask your wife how her day was, and really ask, questions and so forth. The first thing she's going to do is say, "Are you okay? What's going on?" Because
behaving out of character.
to check a box off, hey, everything okay? Kids alive? Fine. House didn't burn down? Great. See you Thursday. Boom. It's sort of matter of fact and business-like, But instead, you really ask about what they did and how they felt about something. And I'm not just saying it's just a male-female thing. It works either way. It really, it's a good thing. It's very helpful to relationship building.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to change the topic just a little bit. I'm going to go back to, working in the agencies real quick. And I wasn't going to really go into politics, but we have a little extra time. What do you think about these attacks on the intelligence agencies going on right now? Because I've never seen this before in all my life. And it's like a drama unfolding in front of me, and I don't know what to think about it.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of strong opinions, and you can talk to retired FBI agents, and there's a diversity of opinions. But for me, I'm concerned and think it's rather dangerous. Certainly, the intelligence community, the law enforcement community is far from perfect. It certainly makes mistakes. But I think, let's just talk about the FBI, which is my background. I think it's a really important thing that the American people generally have confidence in the FBI and its work. And I think that confidence has been earned and is well deserved. It doesn't mean that the FBI hasn't faltered from time to time or made mistakes, because it's staffed by human beings. But when I see this as what I kind of characterize as a sort of a self-serving assault to discredit an investigation, I think that's very harmful to the country institutionally. And I'm just pleased by it whatsoever. And I have some great concerns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, I talked to some very interesting people myself, and some people have opinions about, I don't even know if this is something you believe in. What do you think about people talking about the deep state? Even the president talks about deep state. Is that something that's real to you, in your opinion?
And it's the biggest bunch of nonsense I've ever heard in my life. And in the context of what you're asking me, the premise is that there's this liberal cabal within the FBI that wanted to promote Hillary Clinton and was against the FBI. And I'm not saying there weren't some individuals that harbored some sentiments there, but I have to tell it's laughable. The FBI is the most ultra-conservative outfit I've ever been in my life. I didn't know a Democrat in the FBI. I mean, I'm sure it's changed with the demographic changes, but when I was in the FBI, I didn't know anybody that you would call a liberal. The outfit either didn't attract them or you didn't last long, because, it's a conservative, no surprise, as is the military. So to think that in this group of ultra-conservative people that there's this massive underground movement to be liberal and support liberal candidates, I find absolutely laughable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, some people I speak to are concerned about the CIA more. And it's interesting because I have interviewed some previous CIA agents and people that worked in high levels in the CIA. That does seem, because there's torture involved. So I don't know to what extent, if it's to a great extent or not, but yeah, the CIA does sometimes. It comes up quite often, actually, in my conversations with people. But I know you weren't part of the CIA, but I was just curious about your opinion, what your opinion was on that.
Well, I work closely with folks in the CIA, and it's a wonderful outfit with people that dedicate their life to protecting America. But I was totally against the torture thing, and I think the FBI has always found that when you use those kinds of heavy-handed approaches, your chances of getting truthful information are greatly diminished. You're much more likely to truthful information from creating a relationship, as I discussed earlier in our interview here. That's the pathway that we have clearly seen time and again is the most likely to lead to getting to cooperation, which is the ultimate goal of intelligence gatherers and investigators. So I think that overreaction based on the tragedy of 9/11 led people to doing things that they shouldn't have done that sadly has scarred the agency and hurt the reputation of the United States. I don't believe in torture. Not only is it morally and ethically wrong, it just doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard people say that as well. Okay, well, we have about like 6 more minutes. Is there any topics you want to cover or that I didn't bring up?
No, I think one of the issues that I think is contemporary today is there's a pendulum swing of sorts. After the Columbine incident, up to that point in time when a hostage situation would unfold within a school, the protocol was for the police to contain, obviously evacuate people, but contain the school and open up a negotiation dialogue. And we realized that in an active shooter situation, that was probably not the best approach, because while we're setting up outside, this person may be inside killing people. So a very appropriate strategy was developed, active shooter training, where if the shooting's ongoing, that these officers line up together, whoever shows up, and they go in and confront the gunman and take whatever action they have to arrest them or neutralize them. And that's all well and good, but I think we're entered into a phase where negotiations as a respected option has been diminished, because now people feel as though that's the protocol for every situation. There's a guy in there with hostages. He's got a gun. We got to go in and get him. And I think that can lead to some very bad results. The active shooter protocols need to be applied to a very specific set of circumstances where there is ongoing carnage, not because there just has been earlier. It could be a stable situation, or there's the potential for it. So some really tough decisions have to be made, but I see sort of a militarization in terms of philosophy ongoing in the law enforcement community that causes me a little bit of concern. Police officers spend, rightfully so, an inordinate amount of time learning how to fire their weapons proficiently and gun safety and, all those sorts of things that are essential to the occupation. But I find that we spend relatively little time teaching police officers really life-saving, important interpersonal communication skills. Because if we're really good at those, we can avoid a significant number of these conflicts that arise on the street or elsewhere. We've seen them in recent times where police officers and citizens are in a situation that unfortunately escalates. And in some of those, at least, there's a chance to avoid that with some better approaches and better training for the police officers.
Mm-hmm. Great. So where can people pick up your book? Let's talk about where people can, tell people where they can get your book or any other information, any websites, anything that you think people would like to look at.
Well, I have a website, www.garynoesner.com, and you can certainly, there's some links to purchasing the book there, but obviously you can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and other outlets, order it at your bookstore, whatever. It's in electronic format. The audio book came out after the Waco TV series, and I was asked to narrate it, which I did. So it's in audio book, it's in electronic book, it's in hardback and paperback. And, it's, again, you can find it easily online and through my website or elsewise. But, I hope people will take the opportunity to read it and learn more about this, because I think this negotiation process is probably one of the really unheralded achievements in law enforcement. And part of that is because when we resolve a situation peacefully, even those in law enforcement say, well, it must not have been that hard. That guy probably didn't want to hurt anybody anyway, and he just surrendered. And there's almost like a devaluation of the work it took to make that happen. And it doesn't happen just by happenstance. There's a lot of hardworking, dedicated negotiators and operating in teams out there every day in this country that save countless lives. And it just doesn't make the headlines, because when it ends peacefully, it's a non-story. And I just fear they don't get enough.
Thank you, Gary. I really, really appreciate this interview. It's been such a pleasure. And everybody, please donate to our station at freedomslips.com and keep our stations alive. And again, thank you, and you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye.